So as the service has transpired this morning, I'm editing in my head, right? How do I get this message across in fewer words? And I actually think that's going to be better. And also, in terms of what I have to say, I brought you the words of Sharon Wiley about afflicting the comfortable. And so I would love to give to you every Sunday a warm and fuzzy feeling, but sometimes I just have to challenge my Unitarian Universalist friends. So today I am going to be talking about the will to oppress, and that is in the form of something that is big in the news these days called critical race theory. Now, I really have this Sunday and next Sunday, they will be kind of like part one and part two. So this Sunday, I want to kind of give a background about it. And then next Sunday, I'm going to talk about my title, The Danger of One Story. Okay, just one narrative representing a cornucopia, a plethora of cultures. So my daughter is a sixth grade teacher in an inner city tuition-free charter school in Buffalo, New York. She teaches social studies, and in the curriculum, she is allowed to, or has the freedom to talk about kind of an anthropological view of humanity and the growing evidence that humankind is descended from a mitochondrial Eve in East Africa. So when she talks about Homo sapiens migration out of East Africa, and then I think many of us know this, I'm not sure this gets taught consistently anymore in public schools, but that this migration led to other continents, and that from the original brown-skinned, brown-eyed Eve, she tells her students that lighter hair and lighter eyes were genetic mutations that were adaptive to the environment, right? So one of the things that she has observed is that for her students of color, they get a different perspective of being perhaps, that the way that they look, their skin color, their eye color, is what humanity is modeled on, right? And that the measuring stick or the norm is not necessarily the dominant culture that they're surrounded by. So she says that she can tell when that clicks with them. She also teaches that Western civilization began with the Egyptians on the continent of Africa well over 1,000 years before the Greco-Roman Empire emerged, and that Egyptian culture influenced subsequent empires and has been most influential over time. So for a few hours a day, my daughter can take her students to a learning environment which transcends the norms, the burdens, and the oppressions of a deeply ingrained racial construct in our society. She can offer them a broader worldview. And for that, my daughter, were she a teacher in our state, now might be subject to censure, to fine. In some cases, you can even be charged with a felony as a teacher, an employee, or a librarian if you have certain texts in your classroom, in your library, or in your in the course of your work. In the last 2 years in our state, there's been a near dystopian ban on books and curricula in public schools. And this has been accomplished by the commandeering of public school board appointees, appointments from the governor's office. And the latest, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is the takeover of New College in Sarasota. All of this has been done in the name of critical race theory. And I think of it, or I see it, as a political red herring. And it's been co-opted in a really perverse way. Now, before I start exploring how that came about, I want to say that the concept of race is really an artifact of our society. But yet it doesn't have any foundation in science or physiology. We humans, we share the same DNA, no matter what we look like on the outside. So while race is not a physical reality, racial thinking is. And racial bias is a cultural reality that we all live with, all right? So in us individually, we all have certain biases. While we need to carry with us the ability to be loving and kind, right, no matter what, and try not to act less than lovingly out of that place, it's our nature, it's our human nature. But racism, all right, the ism, is often defined as bigotry or prejudice plus power. So racism doesn't refer to an individual person or persons who might be biased against others. Racism requires broader power and the political will to ignore the basic rights of entire groups of people in our society. There was never a more prominent public resistance against that than the civil rights movement that resisted Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws was the racism, the broad power and political will to dehumanize. Racism requires widespread systematic power to foster and maintain that will to oppress. So keeping that definition of racism in mind, let me give you the simplest definition of critical race theory I could find, and that's this. Critical race theory is a field of study that demonstrates legal codification of racism. This definition comes from a professor in Memphis, and it's the distillation of what has been a process of interdisciplinary graduate level studies over the last 50 years. It began in the 1970s as a response to critical legal studies. I believe it started at Yale or Harvard Law, Yale, I think, and a school of thought which argued that our legal system is neither objective nor apolitical. It's a critique. It's an academic discipline and a critique of our legal system at a graduate level. So out of that came the notion that the only way to solve social inequities is to pass legal reforms which expand civil rights and provide remedies to discrimination. Now, Harvard professor Derek Bell dedicated his career to answering the questions of why, given the civil rights movement, affirmative action, urban planning, fair housing laws, does racial inequality persist in our society? How can we ever truly abolish racism? Now, Bell died in 2011, but he published extensively on racism, race, and American law. And in 1994, four prominent legal scholars built on Bell's work. And one of the authors was Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who actually coined the phrase critical race theory. She's a woman of color and a scholar. Now, that work, critical race theory, continues. And two of the most important works in recent years have been Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's in New York. I think actually both of them were New York Times bestsellers. Now, when I read The New Jim Crow several years ago, I was not aware of the concept of critical race theory. And in fact, I don't think critical race theory was not a well-known concept, nor a hot-button issue. It was a kind of a, right, limited to academic discussion and writing. But in 2020, a young man named Christopher Rufo single-handedly made critical race theory a lightning rod for political conservatives concerned about liberalism and the sympathies being gained by public demands for justice for people like George Floyd, who lost his life at the hands of law enforcement. Rufo had been doing investigative reporting for a conservative think tank on workplace and anti-racism training. He didn't like what he was seeing, and he actually got people who were involved in the training, he got them to send them their training, like their webinars and stuff. And then he looked at the training material and looked at the resources and saw Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist there. And that soon led him to discover that Kendi's and Michelle Alexander's resources were the academic study of, or critique, critical race theory. So he told the New York Times reporter that he could clearly see a pattern of anti-capitalism being touted with overtones of Marxism in critical race theory, and he felt strongly that this was a trend that needed to be exposed. So after writing a series of reports, he found himself on the Tucker Carlson show. And who was in the audience but President Donald Trump? Listen to how shrewd Mr. Rufo is. It's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every aspect of the federal government. Conservatives need to wake up. This is an existential threat to the United States, and the bureaucracy, even under Trump, is being weaponized against core American values. And I'd like to make it explicit. The president and the White House, it's within their authority to immediately issue an executive order to abolish critical race theory training from the federal government. And I call on the president to immediately issue this executive order to stamp out this destructive, divisive, pseudo-scientific ideology. Well, not long after, Rufo found himself invited to the White House. He helped draft an executive order curtailing diversity seminars by federal contractors. And since then, Rufo has been aiding in written legislations in 10 states banning or curtailing critical race theory instruction or seminars, which is odd because critical race theory doesn't provide a specific curriculum for training in the workplace or in schools or in the federal government. Critical race theory, once again, a grad level academic study. A study by which Michelle Alexander and Ibram Kendi are influenced, and they take that critique and propose to us that there's a problem here with racism in our country. But transposing this critical race theory on what really was probably diversity, inclusion, and equity training got stamped CRT. So whether you think of him as a hero or a heel, he single-handedly, by his own interpretation and definition, brought critical race theory into the public sphere by politicizing it. Now, it's hard for me to believe that this one person could understand it the way that, say, a Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw understood it, or Alexander or Kendi. But most frustrating to me is that critics say that critical race theory, as they think of it, levels a finger at all white Americans and accuses them of being racist. They say it's being used to divide the country. They fail to understand that critical racism addresses the subject of racism, the structures, judicial system, legal system, 100 different ways in which we institutionalize racism, racial bias in our society. And critical racism is mainly concerned with understanding those racial disparities that persist. As Derek Bell, it was said that he died hopeless about whether anything would ever improve. So a New York Times reporter interviewed Rufo, and then he interviewed the leading expert and coiner of the phrase critical race theory, Kimberly William Crenshaw. The reporter described to Dr. Crenshaw some of Rufo's critique about racial equity training and asked her what she thought of him. Well, she didn't think much of him either. Because, she said, too often employers and educators want a quick fix in the form of a 2-hour program that checks a box. It's really a complex subject with complex issues and relationship and complexity of relationships. It takes much more time and effort to understand and assimilate. So I do not want to bring politics to the pulpit, but when there is something being done by our state government that is clearly detrimental to our educational system and to our way of being in the world as Unitarian Universalists, I have to say something. So 3 years since Christopher Rufo appeared on Tucker Carlson, 3 short years with his new political best friend, Mark Ruffo, and Ron DeSantis, launched an invective against public school curricula in Florida. And anything that smacked of what they thought was critical race theory got kicked out. This includes math texts that were found to be indoctrinating. DeSantis banned the College Board's advanced placement courses in African American studies for high school students. And this is because there was one small part of it, the coursework, that referred to the queer or LGBTQ among Black Americans. And it's really, well, it is something that certainly you would want to include because it's a cultural phenomenon. It has a slightly different context among Black people, or understanding among Black people than perhaps other of the dominant culture. So anyway, but because it had that one thing about LGBTQ reference, it got kicked out. And this is oppression. Again, my opinion, my take on it, you don't have to agree with me, but this really makes me upset. It robs a minority that has a very rightful place in our society and in our history, and he's taken it away for a very, what seems like flippant reason. How many of you have heard about New College in Sarasota? Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir here, I see, again. He has gone in because using the excuse that they have low enrollment. This is considered one of the most liberal colleges of the 12 public Florida universities. And he's completely taken over, let go the new board chair and 6 members appointed by Mr. DeSantis, and one of them is, guess who? Christopher Rufo. I just about flipped when I saw his picture. So we have to be aware of the fact that not only other states, but other countries are watching what's going on in Florida because they think that this is like a laboratory or a test case. They're looking closely to see what happens here. And I think that having a state government that is so deeply, has hands or power so deeply entwined in public education, that's a bad trend. I don't care what side of what your political affiliation is or what you think of DeSantis, that is bad practice. And it has the effect of deepening racism and creating multi-layered oppressions in one of our most cherished institutions, which is education. I presented this under the banner of Side with Love. Side with Love is a public advocacy campaign sponsored by the UUA that seeks to harness love's power to stop oppression. So what I call myself and my fellow Unitarian Universalists to do is to harness our love for humanity, our agape love for others, to stop oppression. I'm going to ask you to resist it. I'm going to resist it. And perhaps we can figure out ways to do that, but I certainly would think that we could be a voice in opinion columns or newspaper op-eds. We can find opportunities to speak out, and we can connect with our UU Florida legislative, kind of like their legislative watch group, and we can connect with them and figure out how we can get our voices heard and use our privilege to at least have a different voice, a resisting voice against what is going on in our education that is furthering oppression. And in this Black History Month is, I think, in terms of pulling that AP program on Black history, that is quite insulting. And I don't think it's by accident, but I probably shouldn't say anymore. So I hope that you will join us again next Sunday for The Danger of a Single Story. We're going to talk about why censorship in a narrow, single narrative of history in our country is a dangerous thing. Thank you.